I shall start with a few introductions and a little bit of housekeeping. I'm Ed Hall. I was sacked myself from the Navy in 1988 and have been a writer and campaigner on the subject ever since, and I'll be leading our session today. Today's session is being recorded and it will be available to RUSI members and subscribers after the event. So if I could ask that feel free, half of the session will be for questions, but if you for any reason would prefer not to be identified, please be aware that we are recording the session. And also if I could ask you to make sure that any devices, phones, tablets or whatever are either off or on silent. It will make for a more pleasant next 60 minutes. Should we have any form of emergency and need to leave the building, the RUSI staff will show us to the exits. But I think you came in the exit, so I would head in that direction myself. Thank you very much. We are here to talk about the Etherton review, the consequence of that, the LGBT ban in the United Kingdom, the campaign that followed. And we also today have a very interesting addition to a conversation that has taken place for many of us on many occasions, which is that we are going to look at the Canadian experience of what happened there and how they resolved the problems. So in order to do that, we have a great panel with us today. Starting on my left here, Craig Jones will be known to many of you. Craig served in the Royal Navy, had a long career in the Royal Navy until 1988, I think, until 2008. I think he joined in 89, but went on both in his later naval career and subsequently to become a prominent voice for LGBT rights in the armed forces. And whose initiative in starting a book, Fighting with Pride, has morphed into the LGBT Veterans charity that exists today. So Craig remains a leading campaigner on the subject, and I think will be very helpful to bring us up to date on what's happening post the Etherton review. We also have Kat Dixon, will be known to many of you as Chair of Trustees at Stonewall. And also has a background that includes the forces, but also includes leading roles in both public and private sector organisations. And I think we're going to get some very interesting insight there into what actually happens once the government says they're going to do something. How do we then turn that into reality? So I'm looking forward to getting some insight there. And at the end, on my left, we have Michelle Douglas. Michelle is the Executive Director of the Purge Fund, and I'll ask her to explain a little bit more about what that is in Canada and what's happened there as we start going through the questions. But I think just to put some of what we're going to talk about today into context, we should just rewind a little, not right the way back to the beginning of the ban. That's a subject many in this room will have heard people talk about in the past, or indeed I can see from some faces here have had their own very personal experiences. But I think instead think about where we got to last summer, which was the end of an independent review. More than 1,000 people who had experiences as a consequence of the ban gave evidence to Lord Etherton's review. He considered those responses at length and produced a document which many people found extremely impressive. A lot of more people found extremely moving as it highlighted what was in it. And I just flicked it up on my phone, and when we come to the question about compensation, which I think is going to be the meat of today, and people have often said to me, what's the compensation for? The Prime Minister has stood up last July and apologised. Well, I just direct them to the index of the Etherton review, and I think that's sufficient. So these are chapter headings within the review. I don't need, I think, to go through the examples of the evidence they contain. But we have, after introduction, we have homophobia, bullying, blackmail, sexual assaults, only became aware of LGBT after joining, absence of pastoral care, denial of promotion, promotion held back, abusive investigation and discharge, medical intervention as part of the investigations and discharge procedures, medals and conduct badges taken away or demotion in rank, shame and loss of self-esteem, effect on ability to form long-term relationships, effect on mental health, attempted suicide or suicidal thoughts, homelessness, employment, and financial difficulties. So those are just some chapter headings from the Etherton Review. But I think as an opener to what we're going to discuss, they perhaps put some context into what the consequences of the ban were and why we're still talking about compensation today. So I think I'm going to try and get as much time as we can from the experts that we have here. You've heard enough from me. I think, Craig, if we could start with you, I'd like to ask if you could just update us all on where we are in the campaign for compensation now in the UK.
Yeah, really pleased to add. As a headline, we stand on the threshold of a unique opportunity to restore the true values of our armed forces that were lost during the decades of this abhorrent ban. When the Prime Minister stood up on the 19th of July in the House of Commons, he referred to the horrendous physical and sexual assaults, intimidation, harassment and bullying that were faced by so many of our veterans. And that's, in this audience, that's quite a difficult thing to say because I look around the room and I see people who experienced it. So this is an opportunity for the government and for the Ministry of Defence to achieve reparation for this remarkable community. On our journey of the last 4 years, at variance to what Caroline and I expected in leading the charity, we have received remarkable support from within the veterans community, the whole veterans community. And that reflects the fact that this is a different world to the world in which Ed campaigned with rank outsiders and the Service Legal Challenge Group in the 1990s. We live in a world now that understands the fact that this was absolutely wrong. It was a cruel policy, cruelly enacted. So where are we on this journey? The Prime Minister has made his apology on behalf of the British nation, and he has accepted in principle on behalf of the government that compensation should be made. Well, actually, it's being referred to by the Ministry of Defence and the government as a financial award. And I put it to you that an award is something that you might receive for flying a plane well, or driving a tank well, or digging latrines well. But it's not something that you receive for what some people in this room have been through. So I think we need to change the wording around that. However, what I would say is that we have seen goodwill and a reasonable pace being set by the Ministry of Defence in bringing together the 49 recommendations of the Etherton Review. And I think with 47 of them, we've seen incredible pace, people working very hard to make sure that things like copies of the Prime Minister's apology and individual apologies are there, that mechanisms are in place to give back berets, and mechanisms are in place to restore the position of members of this community to the armed forces community as the heroes that they are, and not people washed in the shame of the ban. But I think we do need to make sure that the pace is maintained on achieving reparations payments, compensation. We've seen reasonable progress with that. It's a complicated area, but when Minister Morrison stood up in the House of Commons on the 12th of December, then he faced pressure from across the House to make sure that the pace is kept on. And believe me, we've been in contact every other week since then to make sure that this just doesn't get lost. We get some sense from the Ministry of Defence that they want to keep the pace on and they want to deliver on this promise, but the worry of the last few months has been how many veterans will step forward. If it's going to be 20,000, as one of the tabloid newspapers suggested, then that would present quite a headache, because it's our understanding that the funding for this scheme will not come from the Treasury, but it will come from within the Ministry of Defence itself. But I think it's become very, very clear in weeks, if not months, that the numbers that we're looking at are not so frightening. And I think it's important to pin your colours to the mast. So I'm going to do it today for the first time. We cannot foresee it's possible that more than 1,500 people will step forward for compensation. It's just not realistic. And I know Michelle, in a few moments, will talk about the experience in Canada. So far, and there are people more expert on this number in the room than me, but about 440 people, thank you, about 440 people have stepped forward. We need to increase that 3.5 times in order to trip over 1,500. So we've got some sense of the numbers. And I think it's time, therefore, that the government got its calculator out and worked out what compensation should look like. £50 million is not acceptable justice for what this community has been through, and neither will it restore the values of the government and of the Ministry of Defence and of the armed forces in respect of the Armed Forces Covenant. And the covenant says that none of you shall be disadvantaged by your service in our armed forces, and every single member of this community has been disadvantaged. And disadvantaged is a very mild term for some of the treatments. So in short summary, I would say we are pleased. We have to be stone-faced sometimes, but we are pleased that the Ministry of Defence and the government are acting in good faith. We have no doubt that they want to achieve a settlement if they can, but that settlement must ensure that justice is done, that there is a sense of justice for everybody, and we need to focus very closely upon what those numbers are all about and make sure that they're pushed up from where they are today. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm sure we'll come back and pull out some more detail on some of the things that you've touched on there. But I'd like to move over now to Michelle, who I think I'm going to ask you quite a general question to start with, and perhaps we could then pull down into it. But I think for a lot of us, understanding that, this was dealt with in Canada, is interesting and not something that I think a lot of us were aware of. So perhaps you could tell us, what happened? And one thing I'm very interested in is, has it been successful?
Well, a real honour to be here with you all, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge my dear friends with whom I stand today, Dr. Douglas Elliott, the lead class action law lawyer from Canada, who achieved an extraordinary settlement for LGBTQ veterans in Canada, and my dear friend Todd Ross, who was one of the representative plaintiffs, a fellow Purge survivor in Canada. Delighted to be here with all of you, and particularly to stand very firmly in support of the goals and aspirations of all UK LGBTQ veterans, and particularly those with fighting with pride. We're so honored to be here today, my fellow panelists. Thank you. The LGBT Purge, as we call it in Canada, spanned the period of the 1950s to the mid-1990s, a period of time when some 9,000 people we know of experienced codified discrimination in Canada through the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, the Federal Public Service, and the Canadian Armed Forces. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Canada calls it one of the longest running, largest scale violations of the human rights of any workforce in Canadian history. 9,000 people. I was a young officer in the Canadian Armed Forces. I joined in 1986, proud to serve my country, as so many of us were. Top of my class. I only mentioned that because I also had a beautiful experience of falling in love with a fellow officer. She was wonderful. But it soon led to my interrogations time after time in hotel rooms, interrogations, polygraph machines, until the point when I was dismissed in 1989 with the words, "not advantageously employable due to homosexuality," on my release documents. I was fired. I should add that they were so worried about my loyalty to Canada that they told me if I didn't come out to my parents within 24 hours, that they would send the military police to do it. I did come out to my parents, and my entire family has stood by my side ever since. So I acknowledge all of us who have had that great benefit, whether chosen or other family. by our sides. So thousands of people went through it. I didn't know it at the time. I felt incredibly alone. But I did lead a lawsuit back, and in 1992, it was my lawsuit against Canada that formally ended the policy of discrimination against LGBTQ people serving in the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, we all know justice for one person is not really justice at all. And what I didn't know was that there was a trail of other people traumatized, criminalized, abused, shamed. The degradation of people who stood to serve their country because of this policy is just profound. And of course, discrimination diminishes us all. So let me fast forward. There was a mighty fight among activists behind the scenes, but let me bring it up to the point of about 2016 in Canada. People who went away didn't talk about their service, shamed, and struggling, most with PTSD and other traumas, and I know many in this room will relate. The change in the political climate in Canada allowed that a class action lawsuit could be brought forward, and the Prime Minister Trudeau, also made commitments to apologize, which he did in 2017 in the House of Commons. A rousing round on their feet by all members, opposition and others, to apologize to the LGBTQ community in Canada. But the class action lawsuit that was launched, which I think is most germane to what's happening here, Canada is a country currently of 40 million people. And keep in mind that our purge happened across the public service, the RCMP, and the Canadian Armed Forces, although I would say that the military had the most cruel implementation of its policies. In the end, when there was this great call out for people, and here I just turn to my friend Todd as a representative plaintiff, who had the courage with our friend Martine Roy to bring this forward, led by Douglas Elliott as our lead lawyer. They looked for people. They called us out. Where are you? Come forward and seek the justice you've been owed for decades. And in Canada, 720 people came forward. Now, we know that's a vast underestimation of those surviving members who experienced the purge. But ultimately, Douglas, correct me if I'm wrong, 684 received compensation under a global settlement award of 145 million Canadian dollars. The first of its kind, the largest of its kind as a class action lawsuit settlement anywhere in the world, of which we're immensely proud. But of course, the damage is virtually indescribable. The trauma, the lifelong shame, the loss. So, certainly compensation cannot only be measured in money. We did, and here I hope my colleagues will eventually speak on this point, we did a number of other things to restore some of the dignity and justice to those who experienced the purge. We created a fund that would exist called the LGBT Purge Fund that has as its mandate 4 things. Build a national monument, and that's happening in Ottawa. It'll be completed next year. We hope you'll visit, not just to the purge, but to the oppression experienced by this community in the country, but also about its resilience. We're amazing people. By the way, the monument in Canada is lined with glass tile, reminiscent of disco ball tiles, because we are the gay community and we do have style. But you'll see yourself in those tiled mirrors. We're collecting historical documents, making them available to tell how this policy came about. If we don't have the documents, people will never believe it happened in Canada. They will underestimate it, they'll forget it, and they'll certainly deny it. We're working with the government to ensure their policies are put in place to make sure this never happens again and to make welcome LGBTQI members of the Canadian, to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces and in government. And we're also establishing in our Canadian Museum for Human Rights an exhibit, a large exhibit, one that will eventually travel, no doubt, here, that will tell the story of the LGBT purge. We're forming groups. We didn't know there were others. We were told to go away, told not to speak about it. I'll bet that sounds familiar to many. But finally, there's an organization now called the Rainbow Veterans of Canada. Todd is its co-founder. He sits in the front row. In the last 4 days, 20 LGBTQ veterans, let me actually correct that, 2S for Two-Spirit, LGBTQI veterans, gathered together in Belgium and in France to pay tribute to what we know are gay soldiers, nursing sisters, also queer, who served their country and died on the battlefields of France and Belgium. And this was paid for by Veterans Affairs Canada. Our delegation was led by the Minister of Veterans Affairs. These are some of the measures that, in part, is a restoration of justice, dignity, and our standing as veterans. To lay a wreath at Vimy Ridge, where we know there are gay soldiers buried. This is the kind of profound restoration of our dignity, I think, and just being visible and being invited back into a place we've been excluded from for so long. I hope we can talk a little bit more about that as we go, but I'll pause there, Ed.
I'll come on to Kat in a moment, but just from what you've said, it did make me think that I know quite a number of people found the process of reliving what happened to them for their experiences to be included in the Etherton Review in itself an extremely traumatic experience. I just wonder what you did in Canada to enable people to feel that they could take part in that. What support? What was the process for that isolated person who'd never spoken about this before to go through the process of applying for compensation?
In the terms of the class action settlement, there is a very defined advertising campaign. I think it was of modest success, I would say. People, heard about it, but it was really word of mouth. It was people using their contacts, people going back to people they served with, reaching out. We sent people across the country. We went to military bases, advertised in veterans magazines, talked about it as much as we could. Local television, radio shows, we talked about the purge, but it's been our experience that still Canadians don't know about what happened. So we also, to encourage people, we sat with them. I sat with them, their friends sat with them, and to just invite them, encourage them, support them as they wrote their story. Just get it on paper. You deserve to be seen. And it was very traumatic for people to dig that up, of course. But now even Veterans Affairs Canada has established an office of women and 2S LGBTQI veterans, an office with specialized training where they've offered us limitless, in most cases, counseling and therapy. And the peer support was there. We went and met people where they were and helped them with the forms. And many of them still said, we cannot do it, we cannot go back. So our numbers were lower than we thought, and perhaps that will be the same too. But getting to every single person, not just once, but many times, to hear them, to be gentle with them, to draw out their stories. Can we write it for you? Can we help you? That's what it took, and it's what I know it's taken here as well.
Thank you very much. Kat, I know these sorts of campaigns are the daily grind for Stonewall and have been for decades. So I hope will have some insight into how we can be in a position where, last July the government announced and apologised and it was all happening at pace. And here we are approaching the anniversary, waiting for something to happen. I was wondering if you could offer us some insights into why that might be.
Yes, surely. I think I also just wanted to start with just to say how proud and humbled I am to be in the room, and also just to pass on my thanks and best wishes to Fighting with Pride, who have done just such an amazing job, my Canadian colleagues, but also to everybody in the room, because, you know, every time, certainly, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about my own experience, but, you know, even coming to this event, if you've been through this, you know, that sort of trauma is hard. And I think it's important to recognise the sort of courage and resilience, but also the pride and the dignity in the room. So thank you, everyone, for that. And one of the reasons that this issue is so important to me is that I am one of the people who had to leave the army as a consequence of being a lesbian. So I had that experience. I was an officer in the Royal Corps of Signals. I had a fellow officer report me for being a lesbian, and then my experience was really being pushed out. So I was threatened with court-martial and various other disciplinary issues, and, you know, to the point where I left. And it was very traumatic. And even every time I speak about it now and going to that point about, you know, giving evidence, you know, you relive that trauma, and it's, you know, and it's hard. But it's really important also, I believe, to sort of speak out, you know, for others, and recognise that, you know, we're united in this effort to be recognised for the service that we gave, you know, at a point where we were there to serve our country, and very proud to do so. And I remain very proud of that. And I'm also proud of the work that Stonewall's done over the years, because Stonewall was instrumental in working with rank outsiders to get the ban overturned in the first place. And we will continue to, you know, stand with Fighting with Pride and others to try and get that justice done and be seen to be done. So that's a bit of a preamble. In terms of just so everybody is aware of Stonewall, I suspect most of you are. Stonewall is a LGBTQ plus charity and human rights organisation, and we campaign on many issues for LGBTQ plus rights and equality and recognition, and clearly this issue is very important, and it's one of the issues that we've been campaigning and speaking to government of, but in support of Fighting with Pride. And obviously we're keen to see progress. Now, if we just step back a second and just think about the political climate that we find ourselves in, this is a very difficult time for the LGBTQ plus community. We're seeing you know, quite a lot of political division. We're seeing, you know, these sort of issues being used as a wedge issue in some areas to divide. And we're seeing that played out particularly in social media, but also, you know, in commentary in the media. And so there is that backdrop where, you know, currently you know, we talk a lot about the progress and the things that we need to do, but also there is something about holding on to, you know, it feels like we're holding on to the rights that we've currently got and trying not to backslide. And if we look at where we are in terms of a country, you know, if a few years ago we were recognised as the world leaders, you know, in this country for LGBTQ rights issues, we've dropped to about 17th. So there is stuff happening which makes the environment very, very difficult. That said, the veteran issue is one where certainly, if we were looking at some of those, you know, and bearing in mind that Stonewall is always apolitical, but if you were to look at this in terms of, you know, what could be seen as a right-wing issue, you know, it is less controversial than some of the other issues that we're campaigning on. And I think that there is broad support, cross-party support, and it's important that there's cross-party support as well, because, you know, obviously we're heading for a general election, and we may see some changes as a consequence of that. So I think we need to keep pushing away. The nervousness is the money. And, you know, let's be frank about that. And that is in a backdrop of some of the other things that are happening in this country. So we've got post office. If you think about the post office scandal in terms of the, you know, the monies involved there. And when I'm having conversations with senior politicians, I'm saying, actually, do you know what? There's some very similar themes that have happened within the post office in terms of what has happened to our community. There's Windrush. You know, there's the blood scandal. They've got a number of these things that are kind of sitting in the wings, and there's a nervousness about the money in terms of where, you know, where and what is affordable. And so I think the work that Craig and Fighting with Pride have been doing around trying to quantify that and give some assurance about what that looks like, so it doesn't feel like you know, something that they're not quite sure what they're signing up to is going to be critical to get this moved along. And I think it's also important to recognise that, you know, compensation can never, you know, money can never really compensate in you know, for what the experience that many of us had. And I always think of myself as, you know, one of the lucky ones, because, you know, I wasn't homeless and I wasn't beaten and I wasn't imprisoned. I got away with not having a criminal record because, you know, I left. But many people, and obviously many people in the room, will have had that experience, and it will have blighted their lives. And it is a stain on, you know, His Majesty Armed Forces, and it needs to be to the extent that you can ever rectify this stuff, which I'm never sure that you can actually through compensation. But, you know, we need to do what we can to get people compensated. And bearing in mind that, you know, many of us are, you know, we're not getting any younger in this scenario as well. And so it's important that, you know, we do this at pace. And also look at some of the other things that we can do to restore our dignity and to recognise our service and the massive contribution that we have made, our community have made, you know, to the armed forces over many, many years. And Stonewall will be there sort of fighting for that, as well as all the other things like hate crime and, you know, proper healthcare and all of that other stuff that we talk about every day. But it is always on my agenda with all the senior politicians that I speak to, and we will keep pushing it and supporting everyone in this room to hopefully get us there as soon as possible.
That was extremely interesting and helpful, and thank you. It raised in my mind, I think, a question for Craig, and I think we'll shortly open to the floor and get some other experiences, insights, and I hope some questions. But, you know, a number of people have said to me, particularly on social media where you get challenged from time to time, as we all do, you know, you've had a bloody apology. You know, what's this compensation for? It feels like a gravy train question. And I wondered, Craig, if you could perhaps explain to us, so we get it on the record, really, what is this compensation for? Why are people entitled, should they feel entitled to a financial award?
It's for the most abhorrent treatment of people who stepped forward in the service of the United Kingdom that you could possibly imagine. It's for the hunting down, for the arrest, for the court-martial, for sending to prison, for ripping medals from people's chests, from physical and sexual abuse, for outing to families and friends, and walking people to the main gate with no regard whatsoever for their future. It's for the decades after those events in which people have not lived the lives that they hoped for when they walked through to establishments at the age of 18, full of hope, but yet they've finished their lives or come into the last quarter of their lives impoverished, with feelings of shame, separated from families and friends, with careers wrecked by criminal records or careers wrecked by shame, and it's for the mental health pain and anguish that people have experienced. It doesn't compare to other groups in the armed forces who have been disadvantaged. They were not dismissed in disgrace. They were not sent to prison, and they were not treated with such abject cruelty. And there will not be justice in this case until there has been a compensation that has some impact on making people recognise that the hurt that they experienced back in the day and the impact through their lives to the present day has been recognised. We know that we can't wait forever. If we look around the room, there are some empty chairs today, and maybe we might imagine that those empty chairs are for people who have not made it this far on the journey. So it's really important that there is some realism. It's not our belief that this should be seven-figure sums. We believe that you're worth seven-figure sums for what you've been through, but we must progress, and we must make sure that something is done. But whatever is done, it must be better than what's on the table at the moment, and it must leave people feeling as though they have been recognised for the pain that they've experienced, and that they've been recognised for the fact that they met the challenges of service in our armed forces and so many other challenges unfairly placed in their path.
I think with that very raw description of what the compensation that the community is seeking is for, I'd like to open the floor to questions or indeed comments, because I can see there are a lot of people with some personal experiences here, and I know we've also got some Canadians in the audience who might like to contribute on the back of what they've heard. So if I can ask if anyone would like to ask a question or add a contribution. Please, there's a microphone, and if I could ask you for the record that you say who you are, or say if you'd prefer not to, and please just a reminder that this is being recorded.
Yeah, not a problem. Sean Fernioff, ex-Royal Air Force, dismissed in June 1994. The question really is, given, as you say, the current political climate, the likelihood is that we'll have a change of government sometime later this year, hopefully. Are conversations going on with senior politicians of the opposition party, and do we have a sense of where they stand on this issue in terms of compensation and reparation?
Thank you. Kat or Craig, or both?
Yep, thank you. We're talking cross-party. I'm seeing the Minister tomorrow, and I'm seeing the Shadow Minister for Veterans on Monday. And we've been talking cross-party since the very beginning. I think that there is universal support for the fact that there should be compensation. And when we listen to the debates that have happened so far and the statements in the House, you've heard people from every single party stand up in support. But there are different positions, and we're trying to nail down at the moment what can be achieved and what the aspirations are of each party. But be reassured that whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government that deliver upon this, we're talking to them.
Actually, can I take that question a little bit sideways with your wider experience of campaigning like this? Clearly there's often desire, and I've seen it and heard it from veterans who want to know more about what Craig's doing. How important is that behind the lines, behind the scenes conversation, and how important is it that you have that safe space as campaigners to talk to government without full disclosure of everything you're saying?
It's always tricky, isn't it, to get that balance right? And obviously Stonewall very much in the public domain, as we know. But there's what people don't see so much is that there are those conversations that are happening, and certainly, I'm conscious that this has been recorded, so I won't give the name. But let's say a very senior Labour politician I spoke with this week, specifically on this issue, on some other issues as well. And I think, going to Craig's point, there is the support there. There is. It's interesting in terms of how things are being portrayed currently between the parties because of the media issues. So there is a bit of what could be seen as keeping heads below the parapet currently, more generally on these sort of issues. But I certainly get assurance that should there be a change of government, there would be support certainly for this issue. But the nervousness is certainly around the money, and that and as we you only have to pick up a newspaper to see that that there's a number of these things, and I think that there would be a nervousness to go forward with something a monetary value that was kind of unknown. Because obviously part of the politics in this is that commitment, given the other things that I mentioned, like Post Office and Windrush, and all of the blood stuff, and and probably other stuff. Let's face it. So I think that we will get there, whichever party comes in. But certainly Stonewall speaking across that political spectrum, and will continue to do so behind the scenes, as well as some of the things that we say publicly.
Michelle, actually, on the same point, we perhaps gather a bit of the experience that you've had some years ahead of us in Canada? How much was the court case? How much was the visible campaigning? And how much was negotiation behind the scenes to reach the numbers that you ultimately reached?
I have a thought on it, but I really think the person who kind of led this, Dr. Douglas Elliott, who's there, and I if you're comfortable with that, I think hearing from him on that precise point is really best.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Douglas Elliott. I'm a barrister in Canada, and I led the class action for what we call the Purge survivors, what you would call the ban survivors. So in our case, the very problem that your government is wrestling with and you're wrestling with faced our government. How many people are there out there? Because you don't belong to any club. You don't register as a victim of the ban. Sometimes the records are not great. Sometimes kindly commanding officers put something else down when they kicked you out. So there was a lot of speculation about how many people were going to be affected by this. Our government, when we first started, it was all a process of negotiation. We had to launch the lawsuit in order to force the government to the table. But once we did that, then everything unfolded there through a process of negotiation. But it did eventually require court approval. But I will say there was, as here, there was support for this across all Canadian political parties. There was no political objection to what happened whatsoever. We used to hear numbers like 10,000 people or 20,000 people bandied about, which I thought was complete nonsense. Although at one time our government had 30,000 Canadians under surveillance as homosexuals and therefore suspected Soviet spies, you see. They should have had the graduates of Cambridge University under surveillance. But anyway, that's another matter. I will say that I was convinced from the very beginning, because I had a previous lawsuit for LGBT Canadians seeking survivors' pensions, and what I felt they were not taking into account was the huge impact of the AIDS epidemic on gay men and bisexual men, and so how many people we lost in those years. And I felt that the losses were actually higher in this group because so many people ended up turning to drink and drugs and just not caring for themselves. And of course, there's also suicide, sadly, in this group at a much higher rate, I think, than others. So I always predicted that we would have 2,000 or less people that would come forward, and that turned out to be right. We had 720 people applied and 684 who were approved. I think there's probably was double that at least out there. But one thing that you need to tell your government is that no matter what they do to support people, and we did do a lot, we also had psychologists available to support people who applied. Some people just can't do it. They just can't. It doesn't matter how much support they get. It's reopening an old wound. And so what we lawyers call the take-up rate, was, I think, 50% or less of the actual numbers that were out there. And I don't see any reason why it'll be any different in the United Kingdom than it was in Canada. And the way we structure, and I think this is the way you need to do it, our $145 million, so what's that about? 90 million pounds, something like that. A touch more, maybe 100 million pounds. So if you translated that here based on your population, you'd be talking 150 million to 200 million pounds, something like that. So we picked a number. We had a defined period during which people had to come forward for compensation. With that 150 million included also paying for the administrators and the support and the advertising campaign that Michelle mentioned, which I think is tremendously important. But it's very difficult to reach this population, I want you to know. It's so hard because, again, a lot of these people are, they're living in some little village in Dorset and they've kept to themselves and they don't come to London and go out to the gay clubs and so on. How do you reach that person in that little village in Dorset? So the take-up rate will be less. But we insisted, and you must insist as well, that any money that was not taken up did not go back to the government. It went to the LGBT Purge Fund, which I call it blood money. We use that money to pay for things like this. We're using that money to be here to help support you. So those people who died before they got compensation, before they got justice, the people who just couldn't bring themselves to apply, those funds did not go back to His Majesty the King. They went to us to help our community get some kind of justice collectively. I highly recommend it. I also want to point out one of the things we did, of which I'm very proud. I'm not a veteran myself, but I come from a family with a long military tradition. I have a lot of English ancestry. One of my ancestors signed up for the Bedfordshires in the Napoleonic War, so that's how far back it goes in my family. But if you see that beautiful pin that Michelle is wearing, that's not actually just a fancy lapel pin. That is the Canada Pride citation, which we negotiated with the Canadian government. It is a kind of medal. It is in our official military honor system for people who were subject to what you call the ban. So Michelle is now an honorary colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and so she wears that on her colonel's uniform. And she's sometimes asked, how do I get a medal like that? And she always tells people, you don't want to get a medal like this. But I'm very proud of the fact, I really think that we call those the soft measures when we were negotiating. These kinds of symbolic things to military, I think all the military people here will understand those kinds of things. Getting a medal to recognize that you were harmed in service to king and country. That's meaningful. It's as meaningful as getting that check.
Thank you. That was great. Can I ask if we have any other questions? I've got one on the left at the back there. I've got several, so if we can whiz through to get as many as we possibly can. The lady on the left.
Hi, my name is Sarah Rabin. I am a PhD student at King's. I am doing my PhD in the health and well-being of UK LGBT plus service members and veterans in the post-ban era. So I'm very interested in the long-term effects of everything. Turning to the Canadians in the room, I'm really inspired by everything that you've said. And it seems like it is a very holistic approach. My question is, do you think it's sufficient? I know that's kind of a hard thing to answer, but it's inspiring for the mental health results 20 years after the ban was lifted. The resiliency has shown in studies in Canada. And so looking at the mental health concerns years later is really of interest to me, and I'm just curious.
The idea of sufficiency when it comes to dealing with mental health is very difficult to describe. But there are very important measures in place. Constant availability of well-trained, well-informed therapists and medical professionals has just been so critical. There's a technique in psychotherapy called the EMDR, which uses bilateral stimulation. And sometimes that regards, you're given electric kind of paddles to support your mental health care. But if you've been strapped to a polygraph exam, for example, that's a profoundly disturbing moment. And so Canadian healthcare professionals are learning about that, how we might treat people who have ongoing, persistent, complex PTSD, and creating it quite uniquely for their care. The peer support training is coming, but it's really that informal gathering together, the processing that we've just been through with 22 LGBTQI veterans in from Canada to come to France and Belgium and to be together, to tell the stories, to have a catharsis of sorts. I think that's almost like the, how do you measure its outcome? I just saw bonding, support, and, love as just, gratitude for service, being seen, being visible, and being invited back in. In Canada, they've now appointed 2 Purge survivors as honorary colonels, myself and Stephen Deschamps, who get to wear that very visible Canada Pride citation. That's the stuff, that's the hope. And to talk about hope in the midst of hardship, which you've referred to, keep the troops up, keep giving the hope. That's where the future is, I think. Thanks.
Michelle, thank you. I'm going to get straight on for the gentleman at the back.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Steve Purvis. Presumably, in your purge work, you had people who were kicked out, no records, and then you had people who were incarcerated, am I right? Some. No incarceration. Okay, unlike...
Yeah.
Okay, well, I am that one here. And how did you manage to deal with that in terms of, I suppose, compensation or understanding or making some sort of reparation?
There were government efforts to expunge some records. That's for certain, but that's broadly and exceeded the span of the purge. But there were lots of people without records. So, Doug, why don't you talk about how that was dealt with in the class action?
Can we get the microphone back?
Right. So this is a very important question. So there's 2 parts of your question. First of all, in terms of how do you compensate people for additional levels of harm? So we had a 4-tier system of compensation. We got everyone $5,000 quickly, which required very little proof, and that was because we knew there were people in very distressed circumstances, and so we wanted them to get a small bit of money quickly. And then there were 2 levels beyond that that would be decided based on paperwork, depending on the level of harm they had. And then there was a 4th level that required evaluation by a retired judge of the Supreme Court of Canada. And that was for the more severe types of harm, like sexual assault, which was far more common than it ought to be, I shall say, for men and women. And so that would, there was a group constellation of very bad harm, like incarceration, that would be in that top tier. But there were different aspects of it, and so this retired judge would look at your situation, and there was a range of compensation that she should give, and she would make an award to you based on your particular circumstances in what we called level 4. So that's how that aspect was handled. With respect to records, yes, I remember very early on, I called it Operation Noah. We were told that there was a flood and a bunch of records were missing. Anyway, magically, we've found a lot of those records have resurfaced later. But it's been like pulling teeth trying to get the records out of the government of Canada. We've had to sue them. the LGBT Purge Fund and go through a fourth settlement agreement around the records. They were the most resistant of all, not about the money, but about the records. But we set up a system that basically said that there was a presumption, if you could establish that you're gay and you left during the purge and you say you were kicked out because of what you call the ban, in the absence of the government providing documentary evidence that there was some other reason, you kicked your commanding officer in the groin or something like that. And that was the real reason that you were kicked out. But there were very few of those people, you see. The government was all preoccupied with that, about the real spies and the people who were violent or whatever. Someone who sexually assaulted one of their fellow soldiers or something like that. Well, as you can see, there were 720 people applied. 684 were approved. So it was a tiny number of people who were refused. But part of the reason is because we said there's an absence of records. That's the government's problem, because they're supposed to keep the records. And they can't take advantage of their own poor record keeping to deny people fair compensation. That's the principle we adopted, and I think it's the principle you ought to adopt.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one short last question. I see the gentleman here in the green.
Thank you. Tremaine Cornish, excuse me. I was thrown out in 1977, having joined 6 years before, aged 15. I had no idea of my sexuality at the time. To me, the way we were treated was with shame, humiliation, and elimination. And the manner of it being, of its execution, particularly by the military police, the SIB, was was evil, vindictive, and destructive of the human nature, the human sense of self-worth. I've spoken with many within Fighting with Pride, and we feel that it was what's recognised in America, maybe in Canada, a PTED, post-traumatic embitterment experience, and it goes to the core. But what's perverse to me is that in 1991, shortly after John Major became Prime Minister, it became fine for members of the Foreign Office and the Diplomatic Corps to be gay. And yet it took 9 more years for them to actually get round to changing. But further than that, in the Etherton report, my understanding is that there's a recommendation in short order for an immediate payment to be given out for people who are clearly in one of the 2 tiers. And it seems that they're putting out fine words and the usual excuses not to pay out. It's about time that they put up and get paid out. Why? Why aren't they doing it? Pass it on to somebody else, so it's somebody else's problem. Why not for once honour your word about the Veterans Code and treat your veterans with honour and regard? They're not. It's bullshit we're being given. Sorry for the term, but it is.
So we'll excuse the unparliamentary language for a moment there, Tremaine, but thank you very much for that point. I think we've reached the end of our session, and that was a very strong point to end it on. The position that we find ourselves in remains from last July, one where it's clear, I think, from what we've learned today, that a great deal of work is going on in the background to try and establish the end of the road. And I think that from what I've heard, it feels as though resolving this and coming to a number and creating the memorial and these other things that Canada's done with such success does seem to bring an end to a large degree for a lot of people to a very long and painful process. So I think I'm hearing optimistically that our campaigners think that we're on a road to succeeding with that, and I hope that we can draw some experiences from the Canadian model in doing that. I think at that point I'd like to offer my own thanks to Craig and to Kat and to Michelle for their outstanding contributions, and to the contributions from the floor, which have helped, I think, open up a great deal more thinking for all of us about the subject. So perhaps you join me in thanking Craig and Kat and Michelle. Now, we need also, of course, to thank our hosts, the Royal United Services Institute, leading public policy in security and defence, and leading these kind of discussions and conversations. And I hope that having this conversation here will help impact that public policy debate as it continues here. So thank you to them. But of course, they're also today hosting with Fighting with Pride, a name that we've heard a lot during the course of today. But thank you, I think, to both of them. So thank you. And I am under strict instructions that I should tell you about the next RUSI event, which is taking place on the 22nd of April at 4 o'clock. And that is an online conversation with Dr. Andrew Monaghan entitled The New Politics of Russia, Interpreting Change, examining how and why Russia's relations with the West have deteriorated. I think you can see, though, from understanding what the next event is that follows ours, the context of serious public policy discussion that takes place in this building. And I think it's wonderful that an LGBT plus issue like this is being discussed in that forum. So thank you, finally, to all of you. And that concludes our session. Thank you.